Welcome to Mission Oriented, a veteran crowd podcast that showcases veteran talent from both the private and public sectors. Their impact is everywhere. We are here to uncover it. Here's your host, Bob Louthen.
Welcome, everyone. My guest today is no stranger to the Mission Oriented podcast. Commissioner Dan Gade was a guest of mine on September the 8th, 2020 on episode number 32. This is going to be episode number 177. So 145 episodes later, you're back again. Commissioner Gade, thank you for being on the Mission Oriented podcast. Welcome to the program.
I'm glad to be on, Bob. Thanks for having me again, and looking forward to our conversation for sure.
Well, congratulations on your appointment. You're the commissioner of the Virginia Department of Veterans Services. Would you share with everybody what your responsibilities are in this role?
Well, absolutely I will. And I think that Virginia veterans deserve to know they have somebody who cares about them at the top of the veteran agency, and I care deeply about them. And so this agency is about 1,300 people strong. We have 3 cemeteries. We have 4 nursing homes, which are called care centers, veteran care centers. We have 4 of those. 2 are open, 2 are opening soon. And then we have a whole group of functions around education and transition and benefits, and really, suicide prevention, basically a whole different variety of functions taking care of Virginia's veterans, all in support of Governor Youngkin's task to me, which is basically make Virginia the best place for veterans to live, work, and raise a family. And so that's what we're doing, and I think we're doing a heck of a good job of it.
How many veterans live in Virginia now? We're a pretty veteran heavy state.
Yeah, it's pretty tough to say. So the big VA tells us that the number, according to their veteran population model, is just under 700,000, about 107,000 women veterans, which makes us about 16% women veterans. And we are the highest percent women veterans state in the country. So that's very interesting. And our women veterans tend to be, younger than the average veteran. The female veteran population is younger than the average veteran. So we have a robust women's population. We have a ton of veterans here. Our research shows that maybe we have up to 800,000 veterans. So it's kind of tough to say. There's no precision estimate available on that, but somewhere in the 700,000 to 800,000 range.
And the state of Virginia certainly is the home to the largest naval base,
right,
in the world. We've got no shortage of military institutions. How many active duty personnel, are stationed in Virginia at any given point in time?
About 150,000 is the number that I've heard. Of course, those people aren't my responsibility until they get out of the military. That's when they become my responsibility. But yeah, about 150,000. So obviously Norfolk Naval Station, biggest naval installation in the world. Of course, we have the Pentagon, which is part of, people always think it's in DC. It's not. It's in Virginia. And then we have bases, camps, and stations all up and down. Essentially, the eastern part of the state is, totally military heavy. And I think other than agriculture, military is the number one sort of industry or job kind of category in Virginia. So obviously, Virginia is a military-friendly state. We're thrilled about that, and that's why we have so many veterans relative to our population. It's about 10% of Virginians are veterans.
It's my understanding that just in the Hampton Roads area alone, something like 15,000 active duty service members transition out and become veterans on an annual basis. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's at least that many. So just out of Norfolk Naval Station, the number that we see from DoD is about 15,000 a year out of just Norfolk Naval Station. So if you add in, Little Creek, and you add in Fort Story, and you add in Langley and some of those down there, you get into a pretty high number pretty quick. But statewide, there's about 20,000 people who exit military service each year in Virginia and become new veterans.
Let's take a step back now. I know your story. 17-year-old North Dakota family with a tradition of service. You enlist in the in the reserves, right?
Army Reserve, yeah.
Army Reserve.
So
tell everybody your story going to West Point. And
sure, I'll give the short version. I enlisted in the Army Reserve when I was 17, and military service runs in our family. I had a great uncle who was killed in the Philippines during World War II. My father was wounded in Vietnam when he was an infantry soldier in Vietnam. My older brother at the time was going to West Point and later became a West Point graduate and an aviator in the Army, a helicopter pilot in the Army. So military service was no surprise to anybody around us, and so I enlisted in the Army Reserve when I was 17 and went to basic training in between my junior and senior year of high school, and then got into West Point my senior year of high school. And so I was able to get out of the Army Reserve and go to West Point as a cadet. Graduated from there in 97 and branched armor. And so I was an armor officer and was serving in Korea, actually, when the war in Iraq kicked off. And so I thought, I basically thought I'd missed it. But I was a tank company commander in the Republic of Korea. And I was wishing I was a tank company commander in Iraq, in the invasion, because that was the invasion, at least, was obviously an armor heavy fight. And so I did not get a chance to be in the invasion. But then in summer of 2004, I was deployed to Iraq. We landed in Iraq on August 7th, 2004, spent a couple of weeks in Kuwait and then forward deployed into Iraq, a place called Ramadi, west of Baghdad. And, a certain percent of the people who listen to this podcast just had a cold chill go up their spine because Ramadi was a terrible place. Ramadi was about 400,000 people and had roughly the same number of U.S. casualties every week as did Baghdad, and Baghdad is a city of like 2 or 3 million people. So Ramadi was a very, very violent place. Lots of gunfights, lots of IEDs, lots of that kind of stuff. So I was wounded twice in action in 5 months. The first time was by a rocket-propelled grenade, which struck my tank. It did not penetrate the tank, but the way it hit, it was able to kill one of my soldiers. It killed my loader, a guy named Dennis Miller from LaSalle, Michigan, only son of Dennis and Kathy, his parents. So Dennis was killed in action November 10th, 2004. I was wounded mildly in that engagement. And then 2 months later, I was in a Humvee and was hit by an IED, a roadside bomb, and ended up spending basically about 6 months as an inpatient in the hospital and another 5 months or so as an outpatient in the hospital. Lots and lots of injuries from that IED, including a skull fracture and a broken neck, and ultimately the amputation of my entire right leg. So I'm a hip level amputee on the right hand side. So, so that was a pretty tough. Obviously, I'm downplaying it. It was a pretty tough time in my family's life and in my life, of course. And after that, I decided I wanted to stay in the Army. I'd already gotten accepted to teach at West Point. I called them and said, hey, bad news. I got my leg blown off. Hope that's okay. And they were like, I'm paraphrasing, but they basically said, yeah, that's okay. You can teach here with only one leg. And so that's what I did. I got a master's and a PhD, and then I went off to West Point as a professor for about 6 years.
We do this thing called the lightning round, and you talked about love,
right.
in the context of the lightning round. There's a part of your story that you didn't just share, and that's that you went to, I guess, a Marine facility immediately after that accident, and an appeal went out in the cafeteria. Would you share that part of the story?
I'll tell that story too. Yeah, totally. So I was, obviously an Army armor officer, and I was, in a Marine Corps sector basically when I got wounded. And so it was a Marine Corps helicopter that came to get me, and they flew me to a Navy surgical facility. So I've since become friends with a bunch of those guys, but they flew me to this Navy surgical facility, and oh my gosh, here I am as an Army guy. And they took me straight into surgery, and because of how serious my wounds were, I was bleeding a lot, and they gave me all the blood they had, and it wasn't enough. So, and they'd run out of their stored blood that they had on hand. And so they went to the mess hall, and they were like, attention, we need your help. This Army captain's going to die if you don't come. And so like 25 sailors and Marines put down their dinner and came over and donated their blood for me. And it was just what I needed at the time. And I always talk about that, Bob, and I'm glad you remember that story, because I think as we look at our country, I think if you're not alarmed as you look at our country from the leadership of the Democrat Party, the quote unquote leadership of the Republican Party, like, we have a lot of problems in our country, and I think a lot of our problems that we have are around sort of false division. And what happened when all those guys and gals saved my life is they set aside anything that could have separated us and focused on what mattered and what was important, instead of focusing on what's not important and all this sort of nonsense stuff that you see going on around us now. And that level of love for each other is something that I think we all ought to be inspired by, frankly. And I certainly was. And I've told that story a lot because it just means so much to me.
Well, by the way, I'm A positive too.
Oh, good deal.
Good to know.
I hope you never need mine, and I hope I never need yours, Bob.
That's exactly my sentiment. The Mission Oriented Podcast is sponsored by Transact Capital Partners. Transact Capital Partners is a full-service mergers and acquisitions advisory firm specializing in the confidential sale and acquisition of privately owned mid-tier businesses. At Transact Capital Partners, we believe that our veterans continue to lead impactful lives as civic and business leaders. Their leadership and management skills, hardened in the crucible of the military, are key drivers of success. Veterans are mentally tough team players and creative problem solvers imbued with a heightened sense of ethics and personal accountability. Transact Capital Partners is committed to supporting veteran business owners throughout the life of their companies, building professional relationships and networks, advising on capital formation, mergers, and acquisitions. Contact the veterans on our team, Matt Kane, Ross Harris, and Bob Louthen at transactcapital.com. Hey, you're listening to the Mission Oriented Podcast on the Veteran Crowd Network. My guest is Commissioner Dan Gade. I want to shift gears. Interestingly, I've acquired a copy of your book. It's called Wounding Warriors: How Bad Policy is Making Veterans Sicker and Poorer. Full admission here, I'm in the early stages of listening to the audible version, which you are reading. But this is really heavy stuff. I'd like to get into that if you don't mind. You talk about veterans disability compensation, and you think that the system is broken.
Yeah, the system is broken. The book is Wounding Warriors, not Wounded Warriors, but Wounding Warriors. And you can get, if you want, you can get an autographed copy on woundingwarriors.com. Or you can get it on Amazon and Audible and everything else. And I did do the Audible book myself. So if you listen to it, you're gonna have to listen to me either reading really slow, because that's how you have to do audiobooks, or listen to it on like 1.5x, which is what I do. And I think you'll discover that the listening is much better on 1.5. But yeah, so what I do in this book is really, I think, expose something that we all kind of know. And what we kind of know is that the disability system has gotten out of control. That when you think about a disability system that is not just to the taxpayer, and not just to the veteran, but also to the taxpayer, what you want is a system that is attempting to sort of close the gap between what somebody's condition was before they came in the military and what their condition is as they're leaving, and doing everything it can to close that gap, to recapitalize whatever was missing in between. If somebody got hurt or injured or ill or whatever, we want a system which returns them to full functionality as best they can. But what we have instead is a system that, due to political pressure, due to cowardly leadership in Washington, D.C. and by the way, I'm not talking about over the last 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. I'm talking about over the last 100 years, since right after World War I. We've had cowardly leadership in Washington, D.C. that has allowed that system to grow out of control. And so you have really crazy results. Here's a couple. Sleep apnea is a disorder that's associated with people with skinny necks or who are obese. It is an obesity related disease, and that's it. It's maybe you could get it if you're shot through the throat or something and have structural changes to your throat, but sleep apnea is a disease of obesity. And yet, if you and by the way, it's not even really a disabling condition, in the sense that there are all kinds of people with sleep apnea. They get a full night's sleep because they're using a CPAP machine, and they go on about their lives, and it's no problem. The VA rates that as at a 50% disability, 50% disability, if you're somebody who uses a CPAP. And the reason that's bad is because it's essentially fleecing the taxpayers for something which is a lifestyle related condition, and it's not even a disability. And think about this. Here's something, this is called a problem of horizontal equity. So 50% disability for sleep apnea, but if you're somebody who got your leg shot off below the knee by an enemy sniper or something, or an IED or mine, that's a 40% disability. So you get more for being fat and using a CPAP than you do for getting your leg shot off. And I just think that's absurd. Here's another one. Tinnitus is the #1 condition rated by the VA. #1 condition, the most common condition rated by the VA is tinnitus or tinnitus.
I have to admit I have it.
Yeah, well, everybody does. That's the thing, is every single person, once you're to a certain age, your ears ring at some level, especially if you're the sort of person who has worked in a wood shop and been around loud things, or you've shot guns, or you've been around loud cars, or there's all kinds of reasons why your hearing degrades over time, and ringing ears is one of those things. Here's the problem. It's not a disability. It's a condition, it's life, but it's not a disability in the sense that it causes any lack of ability to do things. But the VA rates that as a 10% disability. And get this, Bob, you probably know this. The only test for tinnitus is when the examiner says, "Hey, do you have tinnitus?" And you say, "Oh, doc, it's bothering me terrible. I wake up in the night, and I'm losing my, I can't sleep because my ears are ringing so bad," and they write you down as a 10% disability. And the problem is, again, it's not a disability. It's something that is a condition of life, a condition of aging, a condition of living in a loud world, but it's not a disability. And here's the real problem with all of this isn't necessarily the amount of money we're spending on it, although it's hundreds of billions of dollars a year, hundreds of billions of dollars a year.
You threw a number out there that the expense on an annual basis for disability at the VA was, did I hear 120
it's
million?
north. No, it's north of that now. Actually, when we wrote the book, it was about 130 billion. This last year's budget request from the VA was about 160 billion in that program.
And that's simply for disability benefits.
Just for disability benefits. Yeah. So the VA has the health administration, all of its hospitals, all of its healthcare spends less than the VA benefits administration does just on disability benefits. So in other words, we're spending all this money to try to get veterans healthy in the health administration, but the disability benefits administration is basically paying that money to keep them sick. And here's how that works. If you have a veteran, and there's tons of good science here, everything that I'm saying is cited, chapter and verse in the book. I don't have time to get into the citations. There's tons of evidence though. When you have a veteran with, let's say, PTSD, or let's say some other mental health condition, and you're trying to get them healthy on the one hand, but you're also compensating them to be sick on the other hand, what you end up with is a situation where the veteran's clinician who's trying to get him better is warring against the veteran himself, who feels like he's going to lose his payment if he gets better. And so he is incentivized to stay sick. So the benefits system traps people in being sick, and the healthcare system is trying to get them healthy, and the two are at complete loggerheads with each other. And remember what I said initially, the entire purpose of the system ought to be to help return veterans to full functionality, or let's say somebody's missing a leg or something, and they can't do what they used to do. No problem. There's a lot of different things that anybody can do with some training and upskilling and reskilling and all of that stuff. You can help veterans get better, but the system, the reason the subtitle of the book is that makes them sicker and poorer, is that it literally makes them sicker and poorer. It traps people in this idea of illness, and it also, there's all kinds of economic pressure here, but basically what happens in a lot of cases is veterans will choose to exit the labor market and not really worry about earning any money, and so they're sort of trapped on that low level of income they get from the disability system, instead of going out and striving and succeeding and growing, and maybe failing sometimes, but continuing to strive and doing that stuff that ultimately is healthy and adaptive to make their lives better.
Does this exacerbate the perception that veterans are uh, we're all homeless, we all
Yeah,
have mental illness
yeah.
problems, we're all broken? I totally want to debunk that perception that seems to be perpetuated in the media.
Well, it's not just the media, Bob. It's also veterans themselves, you know, and it's a national security threat. So, everybody knows that the Army didn't meet its recruiting goals this last year by about 50%. So think about that. The Army fell 50% short of what its recruiting goals were. And that's at least in part because propensity to serve, the idea of whether somebody's willing to even consider service as an option, propensity to serve is driven by essentially parents are are the ones who determine whether a young person is willing to serve. And if all they ever see is the broken veteran narrative, or the stories about, oh, so and so went off to, they went off to basic training in the Quartermaster Corps and had a bad experience and now they're totally disabled, no parent is going to sign up for their kid to be totally disabled. And so if you associate in your mind veteran status with disability, then really you've fallen prey to part of this problem. And so, what can we do about it? Well, I would say to veterans who are listening to this, listen, if you're one of these people who goes around telling everybody your disability percentage and goes around talking about how disabled you are, and as a way to look at me, get attention, well, then probably what you're doing is contributing to the recruiting crisis, because people aren't going to want to be you if you're just broken and disabled all the time. And it's a really tough problem, but I think there's a real unwillingness in society to talk about it, because veterans are a politically protected class, essentially. So, if anybody in Congress says, hang on, we got to do something about this, they're going to get run out of town on a rail immediately, because the veterans lobby, I call it the disability industrial complex. The disability industrial complex is very, very strong and will come after anybody who questions it.
Very interesting terminology. You're listening to the Mission Oriented podcast on the Veteran Crowd Network. To just wrap up that point, listening to you talk about that particular issue, think about the mothers that wouldn't let their sons play football.
Right.
And it was particularly acute in the concussion period, where it was on the front page several years ago. And I was a football coach, and I'd have to talk to parents and say, well, the injuries are worse in baseball and soccer than they are in football, actually, and all the statistics. And so anyway, huge problem to be dealing with. I want to now shift gears, though.
Sure.
And I want to talk about veterans as an economic force.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure you agree with me on this, but I think our parents came home from World War II, and the 12 million veterans, my father, at least in this case, and you had maybe the next generation up,
right, grandfather, yeah,
came home from World War II, and they went to work, and
That's
they
right.
started businesses, and I think they sparked an economic resurgence in the United States that we had never seen before. What's the opportunity now on the heels of all of this military activity we've had for veterans to lead in business and take us to the next level?
Well, I think it's tremendous, and there's two sides to the equation. So I'll just speak about Virginia just for a second. So, in Virginia, we have a very robust economy. It's growing rapidly. Over by Dulles Airport, and then in Northern Virginia, you've got what is referred to as the Silicon Valley of the East. You have a ton of tech companies down the Dulles Tech Corridor. And Northern Virginia is, of course, full of defense contractors and manufacturers, and headquarters of all these global companies are up there, including, Boeing moved from Chicago to Northern Virginia just last year. Amazon, of course, has a second headquarters that's in construction right now. So you've got a robust economy of all these awesome companies. You also have these 20,000 veterans who are leaving military service each year in Virginia, and those people need jobs, or they want jobs. And so the key task, I think, for me as the Commissioner of Department of Veteran Services is to find a way to link those veterans with those jobs, with those employers who want to hire them. And we've got a robust program called Virginia Values Veterans, where companies sign up to go through training, and they get certifications and they get some tax breaks, and there's all kinds of goodness associated with that program. And then you've got all these veterans, and so our job is to link them up and to make the case to employers that veterans. I mean, what do we know about veterans? We know they're more disciplined. We know if you tell them to show up sober, that they're going to show up sober. You know, they're not going to be stoned or drunk at work. You know, they're going to be hardworking. They're going to be disciplined. They have already done, you know, even just regular basic training, even if it's like, you know, I'm going to make fun of the Navy here, you know, Navy basic training, right? It's probably not as hard as Army basic training. I'm just going to go out on a limb. But, you know, even no matter what service you were in, you went through some kind of formative basic training type experience. And all of that stuff together results in a veteran typically who is ready for the workforce. They're ready to thrive. They're ready to go out and grind. And so veterans can be a really powerful economic engine. The key task for employers, though, is finding the right veterans, you know, is finding the veterans who already have the talents you need. And then the key task for the veterans is two-part. One is, if you're missing a certain part of the necessary skill set, fine, go use your GI Bill or some other training program to acquire that skill. And two is to tell your story in a way that's compelling to employers. So, you know, I joke around about, you know, if you're a 11 Bravo in the Army, an infantry soldier, and you come out of the Army and your last job was as a machine gunner in, you know, 2nd Squad, 3rd Platoon.
Not a whole lot of openings for that specific.
I mean, that's
skill.
right. You don't want to put machine gunner on your resume because nobody, right. You know, the local tech company doesn't really need a machine gunner. But if you put on your resume, you know, light equipment operator, light machine operator, you know, that kind of stuff, now you're speaking the language. And so I think it's really important for veterans to lean forward a little bit and to help employers contextualize their experiences so that it makes sense. But the third piece I would say, and I would just direct this to every veteran, you have to pay attention to this, is you need to have some humility about your skill set relative to your peers. So if you both graduated age 18, let's say it's not a college situation, so you both graduated age 18, this person goes into work for Caterpillar helping manufacture equipment, and 4 years later you come along and you just got out of the Army, you're not going to be the boss probably of your buddy who you went to high school with. Why? Because he's got 4 years of directly relevant experience, and you've got 4 years of experience. Yes, and it could be very high level experience or very important, you know, national security type experience, but you haven't worked at the Caterpillar plant. So you're going to have to be aware of the fact that yes, you're a high quality employee, but you're also an entry level employee. And so I think having some humility as you approach the job search is really important to help kind of manage expectations, essentially.
I think that's a great point. You know, I think we go into the military and we get a lot of the disciplines that help us excel. And I think that we carry those. I think that it kind of gets baked into you. You carry it with you for the rest of your life. And over the long term, I think those things play very well in business, are very highly valued. But you're right. You've got to come in and you've got to have the humility to learn the ropes and to learn the business and so forth. So a final track of question here. And this is sort of looking to the future. What are sort of the key objectives, the strategic objectives for the Virginia Department of Veteran Services under your watch here?
Yeah, number one is we have to keep veterans in Virginia. We want people, you know, the sort of there's people who entered military service in Virginia and they're leaving in Virginia, and those people are probably the easiest ones to keep here because they have, you know, deep lifelong ties to Virginia. But then there's all these other people who entered from someplace else and are exiting in Virginia, or who entered from someplace else and are exiting someplace else. You know, they're getting out of Fort Hood, which I think got renamed today to Fort Cavazos or something like that. But anyway, they're getting out someplace else. We want to attract all those people to Virginia because they're powerful economic engines for Virginia. So Virginia wins when we keep veterans. And there's a bunch of policy things that we can do around that. There's tax incentives, there's, telling our story. Those are all things that are important. So number one, I'd say is keeping veterans in Virginia. Employment fits in there, education fits in there. All of that is the most important thing. And number two, I would say, is building awareness of our programs so that veterans can access that stuff if they need the help. So we have a brand new suicide prevention program with millions of dollars of funding, but that money isn't useful if nobody knows about it. And if nobody knows about the nonprofits that we're helping build capacity with, and they don't know where to go for help, that's a serious problem. And so, I'm enthusiastic about reaching out to our veterans, telling them we're here for them, and allowing them to select what services they need to get to whatever their self-conception of maximized life is.
One final quick question: have you got another book in the works potentially?
Actually, Bob, it's funny you asked that, because years ago I had this experience where, and I'll just tell this story. So before I went to Iraq, I wrote my wife a letter that would have been delivered to her had I gotten killed, and it was sort of like a final goodbye and thank you for our, at that point, 5 years of marriage, now almost 25. But it was this thank you letter to her, a love note and a thank you letter, and all of that, a deeply emotional letter. And she actually read it in 2010 ish, 2008, 9, 10, something like that. We stumbled across it and I asked her to read it, and she did. And it was a really tough thing for her to read, because here I am alive, although I'd been seriously wounded, The book that I have in my mind, which would be absolutely amazing, is a book of those kinds of letters, not just of people who were killed in action, but of people. Some of those letters are out there of people who wrote that letter to their family, but then they lived and they never got to send it. And so the entire book would be just that kind of letter. And then at the very back of the book would be an index that tells you what happened to that person. So it'd say, Daniel Gade was seriously wounded in combat on January 10th, 2005. He's now the Commissioner of Department of Veteran Services.
I'm going to tell you right now, you need to write that
it would
book.
be awesome. It would be really awesome.
That is an outstanding idea.
Yeah, it'd be really emotional, and I think the book would fly off the shelves. And it would take a specific kind of person to write that kind of book, though.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. Commissioner Dan Gade has been our guest. I have been impressed with your personal courage. You certainly face some situations in combat, but I think you're taking that courage and wrestling with some really tough issues. And I want to encourage you to continue to do it. I salute you, sir, for what you're doing.
Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. And the chance to come on your podcast is absolutely welcome. So thanks for having me.
Hey, you've been listening to the Mission Oriented Podcast on the Veteran Crowd Network. My guest again has been Commissioner Daniel Gade, the Commissioner of the Virginia Department of Veteran Services, a decorated and combat veteran, and certainly injured as well. Sir, thank you for your service. Army, bravo, Zulu, out to you. I'll even
Thanks,
say
Bob.
Beat Navy for you.
I will never say beat Army except in the context where I just did. And if you want to cut it and use it, you can.
Okay. Well, there we go. Thanks so much for joining us on the program. And that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to Mission Oriented. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and you won't miss an episode. To learn more about Mission Oriented and the Veteran Crowd Network, visit us at www.veterancrowdnetwork.com.